It's 1916. Clifton Elliott is 14 years old, and the vehicle he's driving has just ended the life of a prominent member of the community. We find out what happened next in this episode of Ordinary Interesting People. Hello and welcome. This mini episode about the life of Benjamin Clifton Elliott leads on from episode 5, where we told the story of the librarian Henry Tennyson Folkard and his premature demise. As I was making episode 5, I couldn't help but wonder how the events at the end of that episode affected Benjamin Clifton Elliott throughout his life. So I did some digging, and this is the result. As always, Ella will be helping to illustrate the story with her digital art. And if you enjoy the video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Our story begins on Wednesday, the 21st of August, 1916. 14-year-old Benjamin, known as Clifton, has spent the last 2 weeks working on a milk float. Clifton had no prior experience working with horses, but it's possible that he was trying to make some extra cash during the summer holidays. Milk floats in 1916 were horse-driven. They were fairly heavy carts with huge wheels, and they were pulled by large horses. So Benjamin was driving down Mains Street, and up ahead he saw 2 carts. What he couldn't see was that Folkard was stood behind the 2 carts, and as they passed, he realised that Folkard had started to cross the road, not seeing Clifton. Clifton shouted at the horse and he pulled on the reins with all his might, but the horse didn't stop. They weren't going at a huge speed, but as they passed Folkard, the axle of the wheel knocked his legs from under him, making him fall back and hit his head on the metal step. Clifton tried to control the horse as they turned the corner, and he managed to stop it at the chemist's. He got down from the milk float, he rushed to Folkard, and he found him lying on the floor, not moving. Clifton was no doubt in panic, but some soldiers who had seen the event spoke to him, calmed him down, and told him to go home to 12 Fitzadam Street. Clifton would have had an anxious wait to find out how Folkard was. We know, of course, that Folkard died on the 23rd, and on the 24th of August there was an inquest in court. Because of Clifton's age, he didn't have to go to court if he didn't want to, but he chose to go, and his father took him. He was questioned thoroughly, and he answered honestly. Fortunately for Clifton, the verdict was an accidental death. The judge felt that the horse had been too strong for a boy of his size and age to control, and that his bosses had made a mistake when they'd allowed him to be responsible for the milk float. Nevertheless, the experience must have shaken him. So who was Benjamin Clifton Elliott, and what happened to him after those events? Clifton was born on the 8th of March 1902. He was the only child of his father Herbert, who worked as a railway guard at Wigan station, and his mother Mary Alice, who had worked as a cotton reeler. She was the daughter of a railway labourer. They were a typical working class family living in a terraced house. 5 years after the events, in 1921, we find out that Clifton was working for the Pemberton Colliery Company. He was still living with his parents at 12 Fitzadam Street. He worked as a labourer, which would have included physically mining the coal, transporting it, and perhaps supporting the roof of the mine. Coal mining was a dirty, exhausting, and dangerous job. It was incredibly physical, and there was a remarkably high rate of injuries and deaths. In one year in the 1920s, there were almost 1,300 miners killed in Britain, and over 200,000 injured. Injuries and deaths were normally caused by accidents, but in the longer term they could also be caused by respiratory diseases from being at the coalface. I had a look to see if any injuries had occurred at the Pemberton Colliery, where he worked, and I found a few examples from that time. So in 1914, a man called Joseph Middlehurst was killed when a roof had fallen on him. He was completely buried, and by the time they dug him out, he had died. In 1921, 2 miners were fined for smoking in the mines. This was incredibly dangerous, as there was often build-up of dangerous gases in the mines and smoking could have easily caused an explosion. Another fatality in 1923 was caused when a man fell down the pit shaft. He fell 80 yards down. And in a particularly gruesome example, we find the death of Joseph Gaskell in 1928. To transport the coal from the mine to other areas, they used large metal tubs on a rail, and when these were going downhill they could go quite fast, and Joseph was caught by one of these, and they said his body was mutilated. They found a half crown in his pocket which had actually been bent by the force of the impact. The Pemberton Colliery Company still used pit ponies in the 1920s. The pit ponies were small ponies who were used for the heavy carrying and lifting. They would have pulled along these huge carts. It was a really horrible life for those ponies. They would have been underground most of the time, and they were often mistreated. I found an article from 1920 that said that one of the young people that worked at the mine, Thomas Lowe, had deliberately kicked the animal in the face and had destroyed the animal's sight. So that would have been Clifton's life, being underground, working incredibly hard for fairly small wages, and constantly having to be on the alert for the presence of gas, for roofs collapsing, and for these heavy tubs of coal that thundered along the rails. Happily, we find out Clifton didn't stay working as a coal miner for his whole life. So in 1938, he got married to a woman called Anna Lillian Thurzer Grapes. Her dad used to work as a coachman and had then got work as a labourer at the Lee Brewery. And Anna also worked at the brewery as a clerk in the wine and spirits department. When the couple got married, they moved in with Anna's parents at 3 Lightburn Avenue in Lee. By this point, Anna was working as a stenographer, which was quite a skilled job. She would have taken notes in shorthand. And Clifton is now working as a railway signalman. So he's taken after his father and his grandfather in that respect. Although working on the railways wasn't free of danger, it was significantly safer than working in the mines. And his role would be to operate the signals and the points to ensure that each train could run safely. This was quite an important, responsible job, as if he made a mistake, there could easily be a train crash. But he was soon to take up another job of responsibility, because in 1938, Britain was preparing for war. Each of the local councils were responsible for providing air raid precaution wardens, or ARP wardens, and Clifton volunteered for one of these posts. There were a few full-time ARP wardens who would have been paid, but Clifton would have been a volunteer, which would have meant working his full-time job and then also committing many hours as an ARP warden. So when Great Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, there was a register taken, all the people in England. And we know from that register that Clifton was not just an ARP warden, but he was a specialist in first aid. One of Clifton's main responsibilities would have been the blackout checks. To prevent the Nazi bombers from being able to see where the towns and the cities were, every household was legally obliged to black out all of the windows so that if they did have lights on inside, they couldn't be seen from the outside. And Clifton's job was to check that every single house was following the rules. He would have also encouraged people to tape the windows, which would have made it safer if there was an explosion. And people were encouraged to have buckets of sand nearby to put out any fires caused by incendiary bombs. But he would also have had quite a dangerous role, as when the air raid sirens went off, it would have been his job to patrol, help people to get to safety, but also to report on bombings and deal with the aftermath of those bombings. He would have been issued with a first aid box. It would have had things like tourniquets, bandages, dressings and ointment. The kind of injuries that he had to know how to treat included burns from incendiary bombs, people with breathing trouble, but also people who had been crushed by rubble or had had limbs blown off. Clifton must have had a cool head to be able to take on that responsibility. We know that the worst night of bombing for Lee was on the 8th of May 1941, when there were 38 casualties and the railway was damaged. But Clifton made it through the war. And a few years later, we find out that he was working as a commercial clerk, which feels a world away from working on the milk float, working down the mine, and working on the railway. He and his wife, Anna, continued to live at 3 Lightburn Avenue after Anna's parents died, and the couple never had any children. So you would think commercial clerk is a safe job, but no, Clifton was to have one more accident. On Thursday the 22nd of January 1959, Clifton was driving home from work. He was about 15 minutes from home, and he reached the junction at Newton-le-Willows. And there, his car collided with a lorry. The lorry driver was unscathed, but Clifton had multiple injuries. He ended up being treated in the Lee Infirmary, where he seriously injured his knee. But once again, he survived. And I was very happy to discover that Clifton died in 1996, aged 93, and his wife Anna died aged 94. It's interesting to think how Henry Foucault's life was ended with something as simple as crossing the road, and Clifton survived the mines. He survived the Second World War during the Blitz, and even survived a car accident. But I was glad that that 14-year-old's life wasn't ruined by the milk float accident. We would love to make a video about one of your ancestors. If you have an ordinary, interesting person in your family tree, you can contact us at ordinaryinterestingpeople@gmail.com. Thank you so much for watching.